Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. Cell phones have come a long way from the clunky briefcase-style corded phone to the mini supercomputers we all have in our back pockets today. We use them for everything from keeping track of our daily schedules, to playing games, to looking up information and taking pictures. Oh, and yes, making phone calls. Cell phones have become a major convenience in our lives. So much so, we feel completely lost without them. It has become our lifeline to society. Now, as important as cell phones may be in our lives, speak to many educators in our country, and they will tell you cell phones have become more of a distraction and hindrance than a help. Because of the processing speed and power, students are able to look up answers to questions without really putting in the work. Because of the constant connection to social media, instances of bullying and fights have increased. Because of everything the phones can do almost in an instant, students' attention spans have become shorter as the distractions increase. Teachers and schools have tried a myriad of approaches to deal with the cell phone issue. Some schools have tried the out of sight, out of mind approach, only to have their lessons interrupted by the constant ping of alerts or even the ringer going off. Other schools have tried outright bans of phones, an approach that has seen mixed results. But it is this approach for which our next guest seems to have the solution. With a Ph.D. in education policy and evaluation, Amber Northern serves as Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and has written articles in many scholarly journals and appeared in various broadcast media to share the results of her research on a variety of topics. She joins us today to share her insights on how to implement an effective school cell phone ban policy. So if you're listening, you want to take some notes. Dr. Amber Northern, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that intro, and so excited to be able to talk to you and your listeners today on such an important topic.
Well, this is important because even in my own background as a K-12 administrator, this was almost like the bane of our existence. Like dealing with cell phones in schools, it was just the biggest problem. Not that we don't have enough problems in school. Now we have to deal with everything that these cell phones bring. But let me ask you this question then. With everything, and I know you also have a background as a history teacher as well. But with everything that schools do have to deal with on a daily basis, should they really be concerned with banning cell phones?
Yeah, and I'm going to age myself, but I was a high school teacher before cell phones were a thing. And like you, man, I had enough to deal with without having to worry about them, looking at their phone behind their book or under their desk. So I would say that it's not that we're adding another thing for schools to worry about. It's that it's getting in the way of everything that schools do worry about and are in charge of doing. So in my opinion, there's not much learning going on when you've got kids, looking at Instagram and TikTok and whatever else they love to do in their free time when they're, sitting in math class. So I think it's become a real hindrance to learning and also to mental health and many other things. But to me, I think schools are getting to the point where, look, this has become such a distraction for kids that if we don't act, they're not, we already are trying to claw back to this terrible learning loss after the pandemic. And, this is yet another thing that's making us get back on track even harder is when kids are distracted during class.
Yeah. So, how do we kind of put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak? It's already out there. We know that every student who walks through the doors has a phone in their back pocket, as I said earlier. So how do we make sure that they're not using the phones, at least not for bad purposes, if they're going to be using them at all.
Yeah, and I think schools have tried that approach. They've tried the middle ground to say, okay, we're going to have a red and a green zone. So maybe the red zone is, the lunchroom or, PE, whatever you're doing that's not sitting at a desk. And so I think that what happened was when they had these sort of red and green zones, you hear about how much enforcement was just a nightmare. Honestly, teachers felt like they were spending more time enforcing it. You're in a green zone, don't forget you're in a green zone. And the fact that kids still had the phones on their person was just too much of a temptation for them. And so what I'm seeing is schools that used to try to do this more moderate approach, because I'm sure we'll talk about this, all parents aren't on board with this complete ban of cell phones. But when they tried to do this middle of the road approach, it just ended up making them miserable, the educators and the administrators trying to be cell phone enforcers. And it just took away, again, from time that should be spent on teaching and learning.
No, I can definitely appreciate that, because you figure there's an old saying that which gets checked is what gets done. And that usually applies to students' work. So if you want things to really be followed up on, you have to you have to be vigilant about it. And so a lot of teachers were finding that they were being more vigilant about being police officers in monitoring cell phone use than they were instructors. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. And so, one thing I've been talking to folks about is the need to over communicate with parents, because, they're often, the problem here, because they're used to, having instant communication with their kids 24/7. And so where they might say, well, what if God forbid a shooter comes in the building? That seems to be where their mind goes, the worst possible scenario. It's not just that. It's the fact that, they want to remind their kids to, walk the dog when they get home, or take out the trash, or, whatever it is, things that really could wait. But again, since we're so used to being in constant connection with one another, they were having to deal with those little constant communications from parents as well, not just the kids' friends.
Now, I know your article actually does mention the over-communication that you speak about before implementing any kind of policy, really. What strategy would you encourage when it comes to, or what particular way to communicate are you thinking about? Because over-communication could just be backpacking information all the time and making calls that we're about to do this. So what do you mean when you say to kind of over-communicate to kind of lessen the sting of implementing a policy?
Yeah, I think it means a lot of outreach to families and parents. We know there's data that goes around, circulated often, that says, upwards of 3/4 of teachers think the phones need to be, not in classrooms, and the parents, it's more like a little over 50. So parents aren't exactly as enthusiastic about banning phones that the teachers are. Of course, they're not the ones having to enforce all this. So, schools that have done this successfully have really reiterated the importance of communicating often, telling parents, we're about to enact this policy. We want to hear your concerns, having multiple opportunities for them to come to the school building, doing calls to the cell phone calls to them saying, look, this is coming down the pike, inviting their participation, their concerns, letting them, be heard. And then walking through some of the data on, how disruptive these cell phones can be in school buildings, some of the research findings on, distraction, but not just that, but just oversaturation of social media and the, depression numbers and suicide numbers and all these things that we believe are tied to oversaturated social media consumption. So I feel like it's super important to get parents on board with the why behind this, make sure they're heard, and then give them some lead up time. It's not something you say, we're doing this next week. It's more like, maybe even 2-3 months out. This is what we're planning, giving them plenty of time to voice their concerns and try to answer all their questions. They want to know, what does this mean? And how is this going to work? And what's the consequences? And so those are all fair and legitimate questions. And we need time to let parents know. And partly what I heard in this in between time is having the kids even be involved and have them look into the research on why cell phones are a bad idea for schools, and interview other parents and students, and just try to figure out, okay, what is the problem here, but trying to get them vested in it as well and understand the why, and that we're not just trying to be big bad leaders that are squelching all your fun. It's much more connected to the dangers of overconsumption of these phones.
Now, I noticed that there was the one school, or maybe it was a couple of schools, that actually employed that idea of having the students do that research. But they also narrowed that research. They only allowed them to research the bad side of things. They weren't allowed to bring in the opposing viewpoint when they were doing that research. So I think that's one thing to also keep in mind. To make sure that they're focused only on that one particular issue. Because, we know students, they're going to try to find a loophole somewhere.
That's right. But that over communication was key from what I heard. And, it's plenty of signs around the building. Like once it's enacted, this is a cell-free zone. So the signs are everywhere. So again, it's what I heard was if you don't over communicate, parents are going to be livid, not to mention the kids. But at least if you have parents on board, after you've communicated with them multiple times, they understand the deal, and they're less willing to engage with their kids if their kids still want to complain about it, because the parents feel like they've gotten the memo, they're on board, and they understand.
Now, it seems to me that the whole idea of banning cell phones is kind of like the use of cell phones in schools. It's kind of like the war on drugs. Like, it seems the good guys are always a couple of steps behind the bad guys when it comes to these things. And a case in point, I had in one of the schools that I worked in, we actually had metal detectors. So it was easy to determine when students were bringing their phones in when they weren't supposed to be. But then they got hip to that, and they realized that their phones were at that time, their phones were primarily plastic. So what was setting off the metal detector were the batteries. So they would just pop the batteries out, put it in their pocket someplace, and then they would get the cell phone in. Or even better, they would pretend they were bringing in lunch from home, so they would wrap their phones in aluminum foil with their sandwiches to sneak them in. And so,
oh my goodness!
And I know your article, you mentioned some other things that students were doing to bring their phones in as well. So what?
There were these yonder bags, and for your listeners who aren't familiar, they're like little neoprene pouches where the phone gets put in the pouch and it gets locked. And then there are these unlocking stations in the school where the kid they come in the building, they lock their pouch, they can't get in it until they leave the building and put their phone in the unlocking station, which then unlocks it. But, similar to your story, there were numerous, tales of kids being able to break into those pouches, like it or not. They're not, they are destructible in some ways if a kid is intent on getting into that thing. And also that they'd bring in burner phones, which, they'd buy an extra phone to put in the pouch, and their real phone was still on their person. So I think where there's a will, there's a way. You're not gonna, you're going to have to that's why I'm come around to the full ban is the answer, because if you allow any latitude, it's going to be a get around and for the kids.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, Dr. Amber Northern. Now, I know it seems like the only way to go would be to do a complete and outright ban of the phones. But is there in your research, have you come across the question of liability when it comes to securing these phones? Because now if the schools are taking the phones away and becoming in possession of them, are they now liable for anything that may happen to them?
I actually haven't come across that. I can imagine that would be an issue. And I've seen some pretty elaborate solutions that schools have come up with in terms of making sure that these When they take the phones and they store them, they call it a cell phone locker. They scan. I mean, some of them are just literally a wood box that you buy on Amazon for, $40. And then you've got these ones that cost thousands of dollars that are, I don't know how in the world you'd ever get in those things, but there's multiple access points in terms of keys and codes and, finger ID and face ID and all these things before you can get in that box. Some of them charge the phones for the kids. So okay, when you get your phone, it'll be all charged and ready for you. And so there's very complicated, technology that I think lessens the liability of the school, given the type of storage unit that you're putting the phone in. So there's all types of, pros and cons of that. The schools that I'm most familiar with did go the simple route and get the, those boxes that are fairly inexpensive, and they were put in the office. So they were, they weren't left in a teacher's classroom. They weren't left anywhere where kids could possibly be milling about.
Right.
They were put in a secure location in the office and locked in another office. So I think that that's definitely something that schools need to get right, because you can't just leave these storage devices around anywhere.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think also we spoke earlier about enforcement being a key component of any policy as well. So what happens, because we know that in any school with any policy, anything that goes on, you're going to have some teachers who are going to be completely 100% behind it, and others are going to say, I can slack off a day or so and not do anything. So how do we make sure, or how have schools made sure that all of their teachers were behind this 100%?
Well, I think, and this is folks kind of bristle at this, but the schools that I talk to also involve the teachers in the ban. So it's sort of like, if you want to be a role model for the kids, then be a role model for the kids and also lock up your phone. And some people say, we don't have to treat the adults like the kids, but I actually don't agree with that. I think that, we adults, we're guilty of it too, being on our phones entirely too much. And so I think that it also sends a message to the kids, like, we're in this together as a school building. We know that all of us, are attached by the hip to our devices, and it's not good. And so, the teachers would lock theirs up too. And it's kind of, funny, because if the kids saw the teacher with their phone, they got to remind them, hey, what are you doing? You're not you're in violation of our policy. And I think too, folks say, well, the teachers might need their phone if there's an emergency. And I don't know. I've been in a lot of schools. I'm actually on the State Board of Education in my state. And so I'm in and out of schools a lot. And a lot of them, have the announcements. They have the, boards in the hallways that they can put messages on. They have landline phones in a lot of the classrooms have those. I've even seen old school panic buttons. So I feel like a teacher doesn't necessarily have to have his or her phone, that there are other mechanisms that school buildings have in place in the event of an emergency. And
all we need now is for teachers to start using burner phones too, to put into those boxes as well.
Yes.
But even beyond that, again, we're going back to the enforcement. You have, I guess the most schools, most high schools at least, will have their students drop off their phones during homeroom period, where their homeroom period is. Now, okay, what happens if the homeroom teacher is absent? Are we putting that same responsibility on a substitute teacher? We know how students treat subs.
No, the schools that I talked to definitely weren't going to do that to a poor sub. If a teacher was absent, it was an administrator that would go down to the homeroom and collect those phones, which I think is key, because kids need to see how seriously that the policy is being taken, number one. And number two, if a kid was caught milling around the school with the phone, that administrator or teacher would ask, did so-and-so, your homeroom teacher, not collect the phone? And, if that teacher hadn't, an administrator was quick to go down to that classroom and say, look, this is something you have to do. We found the kid with the phone. And then the kid gets punished, right? So it's really not fair for the teacher not to be enforcing it. And by punishment, I mean that yes, and in the cases that I'm aware of, these schools had Saturday school in place because the kids were already missing a lot of attendance, a lot of days, and so they had instituted that as makeup time for the kids, and so they were assigned to Saturday school, when they were caught with their phones and so that was really important. I think the enforcement mechanism and the other thing that I thought was almost comical was the administrators talked about the importance of inconveniencing the parents.
I was just about to bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah. So if your phone gets, captured by the school, then the administrators call home the secretary and say, look, you need to come pick up your child's phone. They will not give the phone back to the kid. And so when mom or dad has to leave work and come up to the school and grab the phone, they're not too happy about that. And so that actually helps on the enforcement front by inconveniencing the parent.
Oh, I've done that one a few times. And what makes it worse is, especially after a while, the parent kind of gets frustrated and upset about it. So I know I had one case where where I took the student's phone and I called the parent. She had to come up and get it. And it was a Friday.
Oh,
so this parent had enough of this. She said, "You know what? I'll pick it up on Monday."
Yeah.
So
wow.
the child had to go all weekend without a phone. Right. Didn't have another problem from that child.
Not another problem. I know it. It's got to hurt a little bit, before sometimes kids get the message, and parents are more likely to reinforce the policy when something like that happens.
So now how do we kind of deal with, because you mentioned it a little bit earlier, and how the little bit of the pushback that parents may give. So how do we deal with that pushback from those parents who may cite the school shootings and other safety concerns as reasons that their children need to have those phones while they're in school?
Yeah, I mean, I this is the main pushback, and I think what's been really informative is there have been these groups of security experts that have come out in recent months, and these are folks that are involved in security in the school building who've come out and said, you know what, the kids are safer in an emergency situation like that if they pay attention to the teachers and administrators in the emergency. They shouldn't be on their phones or trying to do this or that. They should be paying attention to the procedures that are put in place for these types of things. And if anything, they're saying the phone could make the kids less safe if they're on it instead of following those directions. So I think that having heard the voice of security experts that are involved in real schools and these real situations has been helpful to parents, because I don't think they even realize that. And so I think it's, addressing those concerns. And again, as I mentioned earlier, letting parents know what the procedures are in place in terms of those, landline phones in classrooms, and a digital alert system in the school should an emergency occur, and, the door lockings or the entranceways and how those automatic locks to the building, or whatever you need to let parents know that, we've got a number of procedures in place, and your child on their phone in the middle of an emergency is not what we want to see.
So, and again, with the students are always that one or two steps ahead of the adults. We take away the phones, but now the savvy student is going to say, okay, you have my phone, but now I still have my Apple Watch, or I still have my laptop, or I still have my PS3, or whatever else they're going to bring in to do the same things that they were doing on their phones. So how do we combat all of the other electronic devices? I
know. And I've seen schools go two ways, honestly. Some of them have said, you know what, we're going to ban those now too, because we already bought laptops for kids. We're on a 1-to-1, laptop ratio. All the kids have Chromebooks or what have you. So if we need these devices for instruction, we've provided those devices needed for instruction. So there's no need for these other devices, and have extended the ban from the phone to the laptop, to the watch, to the whatever else. Other schools have said, we don't see kids abusing these other devices like they did the cell phone. And they've sort of turned a blind eye because they don't think they're as disruptive. So it really just depends on, I think, what you're seeing in terms of usage with the kids in the school, and whether or not these other devices have become a problem or not.
So what are some of the early returns? I know with the schools that have done the complete ban and gone that route, it has only been a few months, maybe several months. But what has been the kind of the early returns with this policy?
Yeah, I think we're hearing teachers say, number one, the kids are less distracted. They're paying attention more. We've heard, just anecdotal reports that they're actually talking to each other in the lunchroom, more conversation and that sort of thing. And also, even some teachers have reported just kids seem less anxious, less stressed, less anxious, because we know that, when kids are on social media looking at their TikTok or Instagram or whatever, and, they're often bullied. There's some, terrible things that can go on social media when you're a kid. And so to take that out of the equation has been a very helpful thing. I've heard administrators say, look, when we used to have a fight in the hallway, the first thing kids would do would take out their phone and record it, put it on social media, and make it 10 times, 12 times worse by having that fight out there for everyone to see. So now I even heard there's been less fights in the hallways because there's not going to be a device there to capture it and, put it out there for all to see. So again, like you said, a lot of these policies are new, these banning policies, but promising, I would say short-term outcomes have been reported. And so I can only hope that we'll see even more positive things happen the longer these bans are in place.
So if you had to leave our audience with, I guess, one final thought about creating and implementing an effective cell phone policy, what would that thought be?
So I think I'm going to put the three thoughts all together, which I talked about. One is over-communicate with the families. Two is nail down the processes by which the phones are going to be, apprehended and returned. And three is include the teachers as well, so that they can be role models and we can have this sort of we're in this thing together mentality.
I think that's the important piece, is make sure that we're all in this together. We're in this together to educate you. So now we want to be together in the everything that goes along with that. And unfortunately, in some cases, it may have to be to ban the phones as well.
That's right.
But we would certainly like to thank our guest today, Senior Vice President for Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, Dr. Amber Northern, for coming on to our show.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation, and God bless our educators and parents who are in the middle of all this.
You got that right. Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.